In Victorian England, the church was more than a place of worship. It was the spine of community life, a symbol of moral certainty in an age unsettled by rapid change. Long before factories reshaped skylines and railways stitched towns together, the church stood unchanged, its stone walls representing continuity, order, and safety. To step inside was to enter a space believed to be untouched by chaos, a refuge from the moral ambiguities of the world beyond its doors. By the late 19th century, this belief was deeply ingrained. Churches were open throughout the day, their doors rarely locked, their interiors quiet except for the echo of footsteps or the low murmur of prayer. Parishioners trusted that nothing harmful could occur within those walls. It was a place for confession, not accusation, for redemption, not suspicion. That assumption would prove to be dangerously fragile. The parish church at the center of this story stood in a modest Victorian town, neither affluent nor impoverished but respectable. Its congregation was drawn largely from the surrounding streets, families who measured time by Sunday services and marked life's milestones beneath the same vaulted ceiling. Baptisms, weddings, funerals, and quiet weekday prayers passed through the building with dependable regularity. Nothing about the church suggested secrecy. It was familiar, orderly, and open. The interior reflected this character. Wooden pews, worn smooth by generations of use, lined the nave. Gas lamps cast a soft glow over stone columns darkened by age. The scent of wax and old hymn books lingered in the air. Even when empty, the church never felt abandoned. There was always the sense that someone had just left or was about to arrive. Among those most closely associated with the church was a young woman whose life followed a pattern considered both modest and admirable by Victorian standards. She was not wealthy, nor was she prominent, but she was reliable. She attended services regularly, assisted when needed, and was known to move quietly through the building, tidying, arranging, and preparing. Her presence was so familiar that it often went unnoticed. She belonged to the church in a way few questioned. To those who knew her, she was reserved but capable. Her routine rarely changed. She arrived when expected, left when expected, and kept largely to herself. In an era when reputations were carefully guarded, hers appeared unremarkable, and that in itself was considered a virtue. Nothing in her behavior suggested conflict, fear, or distress. If she carried burdens, they were not visible. On the evening before her death, the church followed its usual rhythm. The final visitors departed as daylight faded. Lamps were extinguished, doors closed, and silence settled over the building. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing appeared out of place. The space returned to its familiar stillness, the kind that suggested permanence rather than emptiness. What makes this case so unsettling is not only what occurred, but where it occurred. Crimes in Victorian England were not uncommon. Violence existed, particularly in overcrowded urban districts. But churches were believed to be immune. Even those who committed crimes elsewhere were thought to respect the sanctity of religious spaces. The idea that harm could take place inside a church challenged assumptions that few had ever questioned. In the days and years that followed, this belief would fracture. But on that night, no one suspected anything was wrong. The church doors were secured in the usual manner. Keys were accounted for. No forced entry was reported. The building stood exactly as it had countless nights before, silent and undisturbed. If anyone had passed by, they would have seen nothing unusual. No light burned longer than expected. No sound carried into the street. When morning came, it arrived as it always did. The town stirred. Shops opened. Workers went about their routines. The church was expected to open its doors again, welcoming parishioners and passers-by alike. Instead, it became the setting for something entirely unexpected. The discovery that followed would not only disturb the local community but raise troubling questions that could not be easily answered. Questions about access, trust, and the quiet spaces where assumptions go unchallenged. Questions about who truly belongs in places considered safe, and what happens when safety is assumed rather than ensured. At the heart of those questions was the church itself, a structure designed to elevate the spirit, now destined to be examined with suspicion. Every familiar detail would soon be scrutinized, every routine reconsidered. What had once been comforting would become unsettling. Yet at this point in the story, none of that had happened. The church still stood as it always had. The community still believed in its protection, and the events about to unfold were not yet known, only waiting to be discovered. The crime hidden inside the church did not announce itself. It did not disrupt the night. It did not leave obvious signs of intrusion or struggle visible from the outside. Instead, it rested quietly within a place that had taught generations to feel secure. And when the truth finally emerged, it would leave behind a question that Victorian England was deeply uncomfortable asking. What if the safest place was never truly safe at all? The discovery did not come dramatically. There was no scream echoing through the nave, no sudden gathering of horrified witnesses. Instead, it began quietly, almost mundanely, with the routine opening of the church and the expectation that the day would unfold as it always had. Shortly after dawn, a member of the parish arrived to unlock the doors. The gas lamps had long been extinguished, and pale morning light filtered through the stained glass, casting muted colors across the stone floor. At first glance, nothing appeared amiss. The pews were aligned, the altar undisturbed, the stillness unbroken. It was the same scene that greeted visitors every morning. But as the individual moved deeper into the building, something felt wrong. It was not immediately visible, but perceptible in the air itself. An absence where there should have been familiarity. A silence that felt heavier than usual. When the church was empty, it was normally peaceful. This was different. The body was not discovered in the main nave. It lay in a part of the church seldom visited by casual parishioners, a quieter space used for preparation and storage, close enough to be considered part of the sacred interior, yet removed enough to escape quick notice. It was there that the reality of what had occurred finally revealed itself. The young woman lay still, her body positioned in a way that immediately suggested she had not simply collapsed. There were no signs of a medical episode, no indication of sudden illness. The posture was wrong, too deliberate, too final. The moment of recognition came slowly, followed by disbelief, then dread. Word spread quickly, but not carelessly. Those who saw her understood instinctively that something terrible had happened. The church doors were closed once more, not to protect the sanctity of worship, but to contain the scene within. Someone was sent for the authorities. Others stood silently, uncertain what to do with their hands, their eyes drawn repeatedly back to the place where the body lay. When the police arrived, they did so with caution. Crimes inside churches were rare, and this one presented immediate complications. There were no obvious signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered glass. The building itself appeared intact, which suggested that whoever had committed the crime had entered legitimately or had access that did not raise suspicion. The officers began their examination carefully. They noted the condition of the doors and windows, the placement of furniture, the absence of disturbance in areas nearby. There was no evidence of a struggle that had spilled across the church floor, nothing knocked over, nothing obviously broken. The scene suggested containment rather than chaos. Attention turned to the body itself. Without describing unnecessary detail, it was clear that the woman had not died naturally. Marks on her body indicated violence. The nature of the injuries left no doubt that this was a deliberate act, carried out with intent. The realization changed the atmosphere inside the church instantly. This was no longer simply a place of worship. It had become a crime scene. One of the most troubling aspects was the absence of noise. Churches were acoustically unforgiving spaces. Even the smallest sound could echo through stone walls and vaulted ceilings. Yet no one reported hearing anything during the night. No cries, no disturbance, no indication that something terrible had unfolded just hours earlier within a building surrounded by homes. Investigators began to ask difficult questions. Had the woman known her attacker? Had she trusted them enough to remain silent? Or had the act been committed with such speed and control that she had no opportunity to react? Each possibility carried unsettling implications. The timing of death became a priority. Based on early observations, it appeared that the woman had died during the night, long after the church had been closed to the public. This narrowed the window, but introduced further complications. Who would have been inside the church at that hour, and for what reason? Church officials were questioned first. They provided information about keys, routines, and access. Who had permission to enter after hours? Who was responsible for locking up? Who might reasonably be expected to be present? Every answer was recorded carefully, but none provided immediate clarity. The idea that an outsider had entered undetected seemed unlikely, yet not impossible. Churches were often open to anyone during the day, and familiarity with the building could be gained without raising suspicion. Still, the absence of forced entry suggested something else. Someone had been allowed inside or had never left. As investigators moved through the church, the symbolism of the setting weighed heavily on everyone involved. Objects normally associated with faith and comfort were now examined as potential evidence: candlesticks, cloths, storage areas. Nothing was ignored. The sacred had become procedural. Outside, the town began to gather. News traveled quickly, though details were scarce. People whispered in clusters, trying to reconcile what they had heard with what they believed. The church was supposed to be safe. If something like this could happen there, then nowhere felt certain. Speculation began almost immediately. Some suggested a stranger. Others whispered about hidden relationships, secret meetings, things unseen beneath the surface of respectable lives. Victorian society thrived on appearances, and this crime threatened to expose how little those appearances might protect. The woman's identity, once confirmed, deepened the shock. She was known. She was familiar. She was someone people had passed without thought, spoken to politely, trusted implicitly. Her death transformed her from a quiet presence into the center of an unfolding mystery. By the end of the first day, the church had been sealed off. Investigators left with notes, measurements, and unanswered questions. The body was removed with solemn care, carried past the same pews where prayers had been offered for generations. The building was left empty once again, but the sense of peace it once held was gone. What remained was uncertainty. A crime committed without witnesses, a setting that contradicted every assumption about safety, and a growing awareness that the answers would not come easily. The discovery inside the church was only the beginning. What followed would expose hidden lives, strained relationships, and a web of suspicion that extended far beyond the stone walls of the parish. And as the investigation moved forward, one thing became painfully clear. The crime had not simply happened inside a church. It had shattered the belief that such places were immune from darkness at all. The investigation moved outward from the church, but the sense of unease followed it into every street and household touched by the victim's life. What had initially appeared to be a contained mystery quickly revealed itself to be something far more complex. The church had been silent, but the town was not. Everyone had opinions, suspicions, and fragments of memory that now seemed charged with new meaning. Police began by reconstructing the victim's final known movements. They established when she had last been seen alive, who had spoken to her, and where she had been in the hours before her death. Each witness offered pieces that did not quite align, creating a timeline that appeared plausible in isolation, but troubling when examined closely. She had been seen earlier that evening in the company of others connected to the parish. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. She had attended services before. She was familiar with the building. Her presence there would not have raised concern. That familiarity, once comforting, now complicated the investigation. Attention turned to those who had access to the church after hours. Keys were few but not singular. Several individuals could enter legitimately, and records of who locked the doors each night were informal at best. Victorian institutions often relied on trust rather than documentation, and that absence of structure now worked against clarity. One suspect emerged almost immediately, not because of evidence but because of proximity. A man known to spend considerable time around the church, often present late into the evening, sometimes alone. His behavior had never been questioned before. Now it was scrutinized in painful detail. When interviewed, his answers were polite but vague. He remembered being there. He remembered leaving. He could not recall exact times. Another individual came under suspicion due to personal circumstances. There were whispers of a strained relationship, of words exchanged that had gone unnoticed at the time. Nothing overtly threatening, nothing criminal. But once violence had occurred, even the smallest disagreement became suspect. The police interviewed neighbors living near the church. Some reported hearing footsteps during the night. Others recalled voices, though no one could be certain whether those sounds were real or imagined, shaped by the knowledge of what had happened. Human memory proved unreliable, bending under pressure. One witness claimed to have seen someone leaving the church late that night, moving quickly, head lowered. But darkness obscured features. Clothing descriptions were general. The figure could have been anyone or no one at all. The statement was recorded, but its value remained uncertain. As days passed, investigators struggled with the lack of physical evidence. There was no weapon recovered, no clear trail. The crime appeared deliberate, controlled, and contained. Whoever committed it had not acted impulsively. They had not panicked. That realization unsettled even experienced officers. Public attention intensified. Newspapers seized upon the contradiction at the heart of the case. A violent crime inside a sacred space challenged deeply held beliefs about morality and order. Editorials speculated freely, often irresponsibly, fueling rumors that investigators could neither confirm nor dismiss. The victim's past was examined closely, sometimes cruelly. As was common in the era, scrutiny fell not only on what had happened to her, but on who she was. Her associations, habits, and reputation were dissected publicly. Some suggested that she had invited danger. Others bristled at the implication, insisting that nothing in her life justified what had been done. Investigators attempted to separate fact from judgment, but societal attitudes seeped into every conversation. Respectability mattered. Appearances mattered. The possibility that someone outwardly respectable could commit such an act was uncomfortable, and for many, unacceptable. Suspects rose and fell with alarming speed. One day, a name dominated discussion. The next, it quietly disappeared from police interest. Alibis were checked, sometimes accepted reluctantly, sometimes dismissed only to be reconsidered later. The investigation lacked a single thread strong enough to pull the entire case together. The church itself remained a focus. Officers returned repeatedly, searching for overlooked details. They examined doors, locks, and fixtures. They considered whether the crime could have occurred elsewhere and the body moved. Evidence suggested otherwise, but doubt lingered. One particularly troubling question remained unanswered. Why the church? Why that location of all places? It suggested either convenience or symbolism, perhaps both. If the victim had gone there willingly, it implied trust. If she had been lured, it implied planning. Neither possibility offered comfort. As weeks passed, frustration mounted. The absence of resolution bred anxiety. People avoided the church. Attendance dropped. Some refused to enter at all. The building that had once offered reassurance now stood as a reminder of vulnerability. Investigators faced increasing pressure. Public patience wore thin. Officials demanded progress. Yet the facts refused to align neatly. Every potential explanation created new contradictions. Every suspect raised questions that could not be answered definitively. The possibility that the killer was someone known to the victim grew harder to dismiss. Random violence seemed less likely with each passing day. The lack of forced entry, the quiet nature of the act, and the absence of chaos all pointed toward familiarity. But familiarity narrowed the field only so far. In private, some officers expressed concern that the case might never be solved. Others held on to hope that a single overlooked detail would eventually surface. They reviewed notes repeatedly, searching for patterns, connections, anything that might shift the balance. The doubt was no longer limited to who had committed the crime. It extended to whether the truth would ever be known. The investigation had revealed how easily certainty could fracture under scrutiny. What began as a shocking discovery had become something more unsettling. Not a mystery racing toward resolution, but one sinking slowly into ambiguity. By the time the investigation reached its later stages, one truth had emerged with uncomfortable clarity. The crime inside the church had not only taken a life, it had exposed how fragile truth itself could be when filtered through fear, reputation, and silence. By the time the case reached its final stage, the public had already formed opinions that no courtroom could fully contain. The investigation had produced questions rather than certainty, and the trial that followed would do little to resolve them. Instead, it would place doubt itself at the center of proceedings, forcing a jury and a nation to confront the uncomfortable limits of proof. The courtroom was crowded from the first day. Journalists filled the benches reserved for the press, scribbling notes as witnesses took their seats. Members of the public arrived early, hoping to secure a place inside, while others waited outside for reports of what transpired within. The case had come to represent more than a single crime. It had become a test of Victorian confidence in law, morality, and order. The prosecution presented its case carefully, aware that physical evidence was limited and that much depended on interpretation rather than certainty. Witnesses were called to establish timelines, movements, and relationships. Each testified to what they had seen or heard, often with hesitation, conscious that their words carried weight beyond their original intent. Small details were examined at length, gestures and pauses analyzed for meaning. Yet even as the prosecution laid out its narrative, the fragility of the case was apparent. No one had witnessed the act itself. No weapon had been produced. The sequence of events relied heavily on inference, and each inference required the jury to accept one interpretation over another equally plausible explanation. The defense seized upon this uncertainty. Their strategy was not to offer a single alternative account, but to dismantle the prosecution's assumptions piece by piece. They questioned the reliability of memory, the influence of suggestion, and the danger of drawing conclusions from coincidence. Witnesses were challenged respectfully but firmly, their certainty eroded by careful cross-examination. One of the most striking aspects of the trial was the way character became evidence. In the absence of definitive proof, reputations were placed on trial alongside facts. The victim's life was examined with a scrutiny that many found uncomfortable, while those under suspicion were assessed not only for what they had done, but for who they appeared to be. Victorian society placed great faith in appearances, and that faith now shaped the proceedings. As the days passed, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew tense. Observers searched faces for signs of guilt or innocence, reading meaning into expressions and silences. Outside, newspapers published daily summaries, often framing the evidence in ways that reflected the prejudices of their readership. Public opinion shifted unpredictably, swayed by rhetoric as much as by testimony. When closing arguments were delivered, they reflected two fundamentally different views of justice. The prosecution urged the jury to consider the totality of circumstances, to recognize patterns that pointed toward responsibility even in the absence of direct evidence. The defense, by contrast, emphasized restraint. They reminded the jury that doubt was not a weakness of the law, but its safeguard. The judge's summation reinforced this tension. He outlined the evidence carefully, cautioning against speculation while acknowledging the seriousness of the crime. He reminded the jury of their duty to decide not what was suspected, but what could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. His words carried authority, but they could not resolve the ambiguities laid bare during the trial. Deliberations were brief yet decisive. When the jury returned, their verdict surprised many who had expected a longer debate. It was a verdict that reflected uncertainty rather than confidence, restraint rather than condemnation. The accused was acquitted. The reaction was immediate and divided. Inside the courtroom, some expressed relief, others disbelief. Outside, crowds responded with a mixture of approval and outrage. For some, the verdict confirmed faith in the justice system's ability to resist pressure. For others, it represented a failure to hold someone accountable for a life lost. The aftermath of the trial extended far beyond the verdict itself. Those involved attempted to return to ordinary life, but the case lingered. The church reopened, yet attendance remained subdued. The space carried a memory that could not be erased by time or ritual. For many, entering the building meant confronting what had occurred there and what had not been resolved. Public debate continued in newspapers, pamphlets, and private conversation. Theories multiplied. Some believed the jury had been correct, that the evidence had simply not been strong enough. Others insisted that justice had been denied, that respectability and eloquence had outweighed truth. The absence of closure allowed both interpretations to coexist indefinitely. As years passed, the case slipped gradually from headlines into history, but it was never truly forgotten. It resurfaced periodically, cited in discussions about unsolved crimes, legal standards, and the dangers of assumption. Each retelling emphasized different aspects, shaped by the concerns of the era in which it was remembered. What remained constant was the sense of unease it left behind. The idea that a crime could occur within a church, be investigated thoroughly, tried publicly, and yet remain unresolved, challenged the comforting belief that every wrong could be set right. It forced acknowledgement that some truths resist discovery, no matter how diligently pursued. The legacy of the case lies not in answers, but in questions. It serves as a reminder that justice is not always synonymous with certainty, and that institutions, however revered, are shaped by the people within them. The church, the court, and the community all played their roles, yet none could fully contain the consequences of what had happened. In the end, the crime hidden inside the church became something larger than a single act. It became a reflection of Victorian society's struggle with ambiguity, morality, and the limits of knowledge. A story not defined by resolution, but by the enduring discomfort of not knowing. And perhaps that is why it continues to resonate, not because it offers clarity, but because it refuses to provide it.